Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this. These last two people come in. Welcome to this Bright Blue panel on homegrown electricity, which is in partnership with EDF. So I'm Diane Banks. I'm non-executive director of Bright Blue, and today we're going to be talking about specifically homegrown electricity, but whether it can deliver clean, secure and affordable energy for the UK. So this is obviously very topical at the moment. So we've heard a few announcements in the last, really in the last couple of weeks from various different people. Kemi Badenoch has vowed to repeal the Climate Change Act. I think one could argue that she's not really saying what the alternative plan is. I can't believe there's no plan at all. I can't believe we're going to go back to coal mining, but nevertheless, the message that's been sent out
we're not going back to coal.
is some people might say slightly opaque, so we're going to dig into that one. So we've also had Starmer's announcement of his massive investment in nuclear last week, which is inevitably going to play into the conversation today. And just earlier this morning, I was reading quite an in-depth article, it was very interesting, on energy needs, and saying that data centres are currently using 2.5% of the UK's power, and by 2035, they're predicted that they will take up 10% of the UK's power. So there's definitely something to consider there, because our needs are changing as well as the need to become clean. The things that we're using energy for are changing. So joining me today, I have to my left Andrew Bowie, who's the Shadow Minister for Energy Security and Net Zero. Then we've got Charles Hendry. Charles is a former Minister of State for Energy and Climate Change, a position which he held, I think it was 2010 to 2012. And then far end here, we've got Ben Westerman. Ben is the Director of Policy and Advocacy for Electrify Britain, which is an initiative, joint initiative between EDF and Octopus Energy. And to my far left, we've got Jim Watson. Jim is Professor of Energy Policy and Director of the UCL Institute for Sustainable Resources. And then Josh Buckland, who is Director of Strategy and Policy at EDF. So lots of experience in the panel. So let's get into it. The panel have been asked to speak for 4 minutes each, and then after that we'll have some questions from the floor. So the panel have asked to be, been asked to consider the economic and environmental benefits of greater electrification, shift away from gas use, but also how we're going to generate all of this electricity. Wider UK households face some of the highest electricity costs in the world. Opportunities for greater electrification for the UK, both in terms of reducing consumer energy bills, but also in terms of driving economic growth. What are the biggest barriers to and key challenges from greater electrification in the UK? Which current and future homegrown energy sources can provide the UK with a clean, stable and affordable system by 2050, or not by 2050, as the case may be? Nuclear, can and should nuclear play a greater role in powering the UK? There are certainly arguments to be made that that might be the solution to everything. How can the government do more to win more public support for new energy infrastructure projects? How can public policy help overcome the challenges that homegrown energy providers face? How can the installation of smart meters in UK homes help to facilitate the clean energy transition? Current public policy effectively reducing consumer energy bills? And which policies are now needed to enable the scaling of the UK's leading homegrown energy sources? Right, so panel have prepared 4 minutes each to cover all of that. So Andrew, we're going to start with you.
Thanks, Diane. And thank you for giving me some time to catch my breath. Look, this is the essay question. Can homegrown electricity deliver clean, secure and affordable energy for the UK? The answer is yes, but not the way that we're doing it at the minute. The fact is that it costs far too much to put the lights on in your house, keep your home warm, for industry to have a presence in this country to any extent at the minute, and that is a result of sky-high energy prices. And we are electrifying. We were very much on a journey to electrification as a government. The cost of that, to a large extent, was being borne and carried on the shoulders of consumers and industry across the country. So that's why we're taking a different approach moving forward. I think it's very sensible. The Conservative Party is nothing if not pragmatic. When the facts change, you have to change position. And the fact of the matter is that people out there feel poorer. And one of the reasons for that is that their energy bills are sky high. So how can we change that situation? Can we affect some change? How can we engender a debate around that? That is what we are doing with our announcements today. That is what we are setting out to do as an opposition, a titular party, prospective party of government. And I absolutely, fundamentally believe that if we get it right, we can decarbonise, we can electrify, we can have a cleaner future, but one in which we are more energy secure, and indeed that people feel better off. And that is not where we are right now. We're increasingly and incredibly reliant on imports to keep the lights on in this country, and we need to reduce the cost. So yes, we can and we will, but not by doing it in the way we are right now.
Okay, Charles.
Well, very good. Thank you very much indeed. It's always a pleasure to share a platform with Andrew. I think Andrew was the standout energy minister of the 14 years of Conservative government. I think he was an outstanding minister.
Oh, no, in your show. Mutual appreciation.
Well, in the last 12 years.
In the last 12 years, okay, yeah, okay, fine.
But I think we need to accept that what's been done in terms of clean, affordable energy was one of the great successes of the Conservative government. And in 2010, 7% of our electricity was coming from renewables. By the time we left office, it's over 50%. Add in nuclear, 70% of the electricity we use is clean in this country. And that is a remarkable success. And offshore wind as an industry, which didn't really exist 20 years ago, is now globally mature as the one where the UK is seen as being the absolute leaders within that. And it worries me greatly, actually, that we're not looking to move away, it seems, from some of the rhetoric from what was such a popular and successful area. That the polls suggest 60-70% of the public want to see the continuing move towards clean energy. It was by far and away our most popular policy. Some people say our only popular policy. And therefore, I think we need to be very careful how we take this debate forward. And we also have to be very careful in terms of the engagement with industry. The industry has hundreds of billions ready to invest in this country. Scottish Power alone, £24 billion they're looking to invest in our energy infrastructure, in renewables, in grid, in carbon capture, right across the spectrum. And the party needs to move very urgently to clear for them, do you want that investment, or are you saying go somewhere else if you're going to invest in solar and wind? The industry hates anxiety, it hates uncertainty, and it will be having to look at its longer term plans to decide whether it wants to invest here or not. And I hope that we can start to get some of that clarity coming through. The growth of electrification is a global trend. That last year, the global energy demand went up by 2%. The growth of electricity went up by 4%. Our use of electricity will double over the years to 2050 as we electrify more of our vehicles and more of the heat element, which so far we haven't made as much progress as we need to do. And that we should be part of that process. But where Claire Coutinho is 100% right, is we've got to refocus this and start looking at costs. And it's been, I think we've talked more about the climate aspects and security, and then costs as an afterthought, and costs has to be moved up that agenda. Because we have to find a way of carrying people with us in this journey. I think that we could find ways of bringing those costs down without getting rid of the Climate Change Act. I don't think it's a barrier to making that happen. I certainly think that nuclear needs to be part of that mix going forward. But again, we've got to give more clarity that it'll take about 25 years from 2008, when Labour started that journey, to when we'll have built the first 2 plants. 6 gigawatts will be on the wires. The ambition is to do another 18 gigawatts in 15 years. Well, that's an unbelievable step up in terms of delivery. And what does that mean in terms of planning, in terms of regulation, in terms of skills, in terms of standardisation of approaches, which we've not done enough of historically in the UK in the past. We sort of did one of each and thinking that's the best way of spreading risk, but we never then got the benefits of economies of scale. So that we can deliver this agenda. It's one which we should be incredibly proud of for the leadership the Conservative Party has given in this area. And I'd be very concerned if we started to resile from that and to give people an issue that were an impression that we were no longer thinking so much about the broader aspects of this agenda.
Thank you, Charles. Josh.
Thanks so much, Dan, and lovely to see everyone this afternoon. Obviously, the title of the session is Homegrown Energy, and a lot of the political conversation then turns to kind of energy independence tends to be the phrase. The phrase I actually prefer is energy autonomy. And autonomy, I was looking it up on ChatGPT on the train. Kind of the definition it gives you is make decisions free from external influence and control. And that seems to me at the heart of kind of what we're trying to do and what all parties are trying to do when it comes to sort of energy policy. And obviously the kind of Russia-Ukraine crisis showed the importance of that, the spike in oil and gas prices, the issues around security and resilience in that context. And obviously for a number of years we've been talking about what the UK needs to do to evolve its energy landscape to respond to that. Obviously as a company we think electricity is key to that, and one point I just picked Charles up on is I think you're totally right, we've made a lot of progress and the previous government made significant progress in cleaning up electricity. However, electricity is still only, I think you'll correct me Ben, about 25% of our total energy demand. So you've got a chunk of electricity that is being utilised and is getting increasingly clean, but the vast majority of our energy supply is still from other sources, principally oil and gas. So the big conundrum for the UK as it looks to try and make itself more energy autonomous is around how on earth it gets away from that proportion of electricity supply and electrifies the wider proportion of the economy. Obviously, oil and gas is just simply a declining source within the UK waters. I was in government for about a decade, and this concern was always by 2030 we will be having less than 50% of our supply of oil and gas coming from domestic sources. There is a political conversation around the trajectory and the decisions that are needed and the implications that has for communities, but fundamentally that is a trend that is not going to change. And so for us, the focus has to be on electrification. There's probably three quick ways I would focus on around how we make more of electricity in the UK and how we increase the proportion of our final energy demand that's sourced from electricity. Firstly, a topic we talk a lot about and the current government has talked a fair bit about is how on earth do we make sure we're sorting out the pace of building. We can't make ourselves more increase our level of autonomy on energy if it isn't, we don't have the ability to actually deliver the infrastructure that's required. And Sizewell C has talked about a lot in this context. There were 4,000 separate documents for the planning process of Sizewell C. The environmental statement alone was 40,000 pages. That sort of challenge to try and get major infrastructure built in this country is a real issue, and it's something we've got to resolve. Not just for energy, but given the importance and the urgency of the energy piece, it seems to be obvious. The second is actually around diversity. If you actually look at the history of the UK's energy supply, we've always had a range of different supply sources and an element of diversity. I mean, you talked about nuclear being an opportunity, Charles, I agree, but actually at the moment all we're trying to do is rebuild the nuclear power that we're losing. Traditionally, nuclear has supplied about 25% of our domestic electricity supply. That needs to grow as a total absolute volume because we're going to be electrifying the economy, but actually most reasonable estimates put nuclear at around about 20% on an ongoing basis. And so that's the challenge we have. We should be creating diversity of sources and supply, and history tells you that being subservient to one technology in particular can cause its own problems. Finally, I think, and both of the previous panelists have said this, fair electricity pricing. Currently, electricity costs are split between kind of fixed policy added costs and wholesale costs. Around 16% of the electricity bill is already kind of fixed policy costs, and that is only growing. And so one of the big challenges around how on earth do you actually make electricity affordable? Because again, if you can't empower businesses, critically, that is talked about not enough, but also households, to make the switch to electricity, then in reality you're not going to give them a fair choice. And so electricity pricing and the trajectory for fixed costs and how those are dealt with seems to me the biggest agenda. And that is one thing that it's very good to see the kind of the party talking about now, and is obviously something that's going to be really central over the coming months, because There was an article today around how even just network costs are going to increase by 3.7 billion from next April. And so these debates around fixed costs are going to be a really significant part of the agenda. And I think the hope we've got is that whichever party of government it is, they are looking carefully about how they make electricity competitive with other forms of energy.
Okay, thank you, Josh. Jim.
Thanks very much. So, yeah, like most of the other panelists, I think starting point is, yes, electricity prices, energy prices are too high. But I think it is worth clearing up in the context of this particular party conference why that is. So the shock we've seen over the last 2 to 3 years is mainly driven by the price of gas. It's not driven by policy costs, it's not driven by subsidies to renewables, it's driven by the price of gas. And I think that is important to recognise, because if we don't get that right, we then start off going down the wrong track with the solution. So those prices, those costs have started to fall again from their peak, but they are still, for an average household, £500 to £600 more you're paying for your energy bill than you were before the crisis hit. So in terms of how you tackle that and how you tackle climate change and security, because all of these things do matter, I think Charles is right. Yes, electrification and homegrown electrification can make a big contribution. Personally, I would start by continuing to do what successive governments have done under Conservatives, under the Coalition, and now under Labour, which is do as much as you can to deploy wind and solar and other renewables, because they're the cheapest form of electricity. You, at the same time, have to sort out things like networks and flexibility and long-term storage. Otherwise, those costs are not going to feed through into consumer bills and we won't get the benefits from that deployment. But the cost of that generation is much, much lower than others. But if we don't sort out all those other things at the same time, people are not going to see the benefits. And I think that's sometimes where polls show that people don't believe the costs have fallen because they're not seeing it in their bill. So there is that disconnect, and there's a need to continue that decoupling journey. I have a couple of caveats on this kind of homegrown, a bit like Josh, whether it's autonomy or whether it's interdependence, which is what I prefer. I think the idea that one country is going to become entirely independent for its energy is for the birds. I mean, even the US, which has been talking about it ever since President Nixon, has never had full disconnection of its energy needs from everybody else. It trades energy, it is affected by what happens in the rest of the world, but not as much as we are. And one area I'd emphasise, because the UK has built a lot of it, is interconnector capacity. So that's a way in which we can share our security with our neighbours that we get on with, that are our allies, whether it be Norway or France or Denmark. So we have twice as much capacity as we had for interconnectors just 5 years ago. And that can add to diversity, something else which has just been mentioned by Josh as well. It was Winston Churchill who first realised that diversity was a bedrock of any kind of energy security strategy. He was thinking about the Navy rather than the electricity system, but that diversity also includes connecting to other countries and that flexibility that goes with it. On nuclear, very quickly, I think nuclear can play a bigger role than it has. Yes, that share has gone down, but it really needs to sort out, or the industry needs to sort out with government and other stakeholders, the cost problem. Delivering cheaper and quicker is required. Otherwise, nuclear is just going to be a bit too slow to deliver on the things we need. Whether it be tackling climate change, which climate change is not going to wait for delayed nuclear reactors. So we really need to find ways of delivering it more quickly to do it. So I think overall, homegrown energy is a good thing, but we have to not think of it in terms of cutting ourselves off from our neighbours, because that is one way to add to that resilience rather than taking away from it. And we also, as we electrify, have to think about the security of that electricity infrastructure more and more and more. If I talk to my colleagues elsewhere in Europe, they are more worried than perhaps we are about attacks on interconnectors, about cybersecurity, etc. Everything we do depends on electricity, so making sure that we invest enough, and again back to investment, in the security of that infrastructure as well as tackling climate change is really, really essential. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. And then Ben.
Thank you. I spoke to Josh just before this panel, and he said we agreed last time we were on a panel together too much, so I'm going to start by agreeing with Josh. The diversity of sources point is really important. One of the things that is curious is that the UK is one of the only countries in the world which has built almost its entire strategy on offshore wind. And that's a perfectly legitimate choice, but it has created difficulties in an environment in which that technology has become very, very expensive. And I don't think, I'm not criticising offshore wind, but the reality is that we need to have more diversity of source, because that's how you get to that kind of security, autonomy point, whatever you want to call it. I think to the kind of core question about can we deliver clean, secure and affordable energy through electricity, of course we can. As everyone seems to agree, yes we can. And I think more to the point, we're going to have to, like it or not, because global capital, leadership, all those things is flowing towards electrification in all of the major powers all over the world. And as Jim quite rightly said, even countries that have tried to pivot away from that over the last 30 years haven't done so successfully. And that is just the direction of travel. To some extent, it's a kind of get involved, get left behind conversation for the UK. That said, of course, cost is a huge problem, right? We're not going to get what we need to until we stop treating the clean energy conversation as solely a building infrastructure conversation, because it needs to focus on electrification of demand just as much as it does building things, because that is where we lose people, and we have over the last 15 to 20 years lost people. That debate's obviously been dominated by how many gigawatts we can build, how many projects, how many jobs, many of which haven't actually appeared. And of course, it's been a massive success story, and that's something that the last government should absolutely celebrate. It's been a huge success story. It drew billions of pounds into the UK economy, going so hard on offshore wind. The CFDs have been copied all over the world. It was a UK idea. All that stuff is great, but we now need to think about how people use energy and how they pay for that energy, and that applies to both in industry and in the home. So there is obviously a demand gap. In my view, electric technologies are better technologies. There's a lot of decent polling out there that suggests that consumers who use these technologies in homes, on the roads, etc., really love them. There is great evidence that the likes of solar on your home can meaningfully reduce your bills in a very, very high cost environment. That's really important. But I think it's time that politicians of all colours start pivoting energy security towards financial security. And I think that is absolutely key in this conversation, because until people start seeing that benefit of the electricity we generate in this country, that consent is just going to continue to crumble, and we will see parties start to weaponise it, as some already have. There are within that obviously several policy challenges. I would call them policy failures over the last few years. I'm just going to pick up on two. One of them has already been mentioned, which is the levies. It's something we all on this panel, I'm sure all of you in the room, talk about a lot. The way we charge energy bills, electricity specifically, but energy bills in this country is regressive. It is not helpful to the cause of electrification, because we load so much cost onto electricity and very little onto gas. That's just very simple economics. It's not going to be incentivized to get a heat pump or an EV or solar panels if you're going to have to pay more for it because gas is subsidized by it. I think there's a related but separate conversation in industry. Industry is harder because obviously lots of industry are going to have to use gas well into the future. Electrification is not necessarily going to be an option for them quickly. I'm thinking steel, cement, etc. But policy has been designed such that many sectors of the economy, which are high growth sectors of the economy, are subsidising those parts of heavy industry through the various schemes, the industry supercharger scheme, the new scheme that's going to be consulted on next year. And this kind of creates this perverse incentive, often, to be frank, to prop up the economy of a politician's imagination rather than the economy as it exists in the real world. And I think we need to have a more frank conversation about which sectors we do want to support with their energy costs as opposed to those we want to support for political reasons, because that way madness lies. So I'm just going to kind of close on those two key points. One is the politics. The politics of this has become unhelpful. I think it is deeply unserious for the Conservative Party to talk about scrapping the Climate Change Act, having supported it and seen it underpin so many of its policy successes over the last 15 years. Sorry, Andrew, had to say it. But I think that the last government, this was always coming, this problem of cost. The way we have approached policy, which is such a supply-heavy focus, was always going to have this demand lag. And until we start addressing demand, and that means cost for the consumer, both domestic and non-domestic, this challenge is not going to go away.
Thank you, Ben. Right, so we need to find a solution that balances the challenges of costs, climate change and security. And something else that has emerged, I think, from the panel so far is that the extent to which actually we are looking for energy autonomy or what kind of types of interdependence do we want with other nations, to what extent is it desirable that we're self-sufficient at all. So I'm going to take some questions. I think we've got half an hour for questions. So I'm going to take them in twos, and in the middle there, first hand up, and then directly in front of you. If you could say who you are, where you're from, and then keep your question brief.
Hi, Alex, host of the largest energy podcast, the Wolf Power Club, and also the chair of the Spectator Energy Summit. I think the panel have missed something really exciting about homegrown energy. Awesome jobs being made. So like back in February, we had National Grid on the podcast talk about the 16.5 billion that's going to be spent, 13.5 billion of that in the UK. And I understand they're large costs, but it's British engineers, British businesses, British things. It's masses of economic drive. So I was going to ask all the panellists, how can we start framing it instead of costs as really good jobs in Britain, really good economy drivers, and actually really wealthy families and households because we're building great energy infrastructure?
Great question, and directly in front of you.
Thank you. Dan Bennett from Momentum. Just when we're considering homegrown energy, we hear a lot about nuclear. We all know that nuclear is essential. Mr. Bowie's banging the drum for oil and gas, but one of the sources of energy that we don't hear a lot about is tidal. So could the panel give their views on where they see tidal energy fitting into the energy mix?
That's one for Charles.
Okay. All right. So we've got two quite different questions. So job creation and tidal energy. All right. Well, Charles, why don't you go first?
So I wrote the review for government on tidal. I said that it was something we should go forward with. We should have built the Swansea Lagoon. If the government had gone ahead with that when I wrote my report 9 years ago, it would be built by now, operating, and we'd be looking at where the next one should be. And I think that was a mistake by the past administration. And it would have created another industry where we could have been global leaders. Second highest tidal reach in the world. Why were we not using it? And eventually, one day, we will. But my fear is it'll be Chinese technology and skills from elsewhere who will be the people who will be getting the economic gain from it. Alex, on your point, one of the problems we faced in this area was that because of the way in which the auction process worked, it only focused on price. And so in order to bid in for an offshore wind or a huge solar contract, that you had to find the cheapest way of production, and that meant that people brought in the nacelles, the turbines, the blades, mostly from Asia. And we didn't see anything like the number of jobs in the UK that we ought to have seen as part of that process. I think for the government, they talk now about making sure we get the next wave of jobs. It's really difficult, because if we do want that to happen, then the cost of building that infrastructure is going to go up, because it is more expensive to build it here than it is in Asia. And so somehow we've got to find a way of trying to reconcile that and saying, yes, we want to get more of those green jobs. We want people to feel that this is bringing real benefits to their communities, but without overburdening the consumer by having to pay higher prices for the infrastructure.
Okay, Andrew, do you want to come on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, look, just to get a few things straight before we move on, I am very proud of what we achieved in government. And, you know, I used to go around the world to the G20, G7 summits and, you know, talk about the fact that we were very proud as a Conservative government to have built the first, second, third, fourth and fifth largest offshore wind farms in the world, generating power into the UK right now, having halved our carbon emissions whilst growing the economy. And we were the envy of the developed world in doing that. I am still proud of our rec, and I think we should shout about it. But as I said, the cost is far too high on individuals. It's far too high on business. There needs to be a reset. We need to decarbonise. We need to move to a more sustainable future. But the way that we were going about doing that, I don't think was conducive to continued public support for that project, because they were feeling it too much in their pockets. And I think that is why we have got the change that we need. Separately, yes, I am banging the drum for oil and gas. That's not because I think the future is fossil fuel. It's not. We need to decarbonise. We need to transition. I'm doing it for two reasons, ultimately. One is because we need to be energy secure, and to be energy secure, we need an abundance of energy. And whilst we still have oil and gas on the UK continental shelf, I do believe we should be utilising that, exploiting that vast resource. Indeed, every other country in the world is doing so, where they are lucky enough to have that. The decline that we're seeing, and it is a declining basin, but it's being accelerated by an artificial timetable imposed by Whitehall on an industry which was shrinking to begin with, but is speeding up its its reduction in terms of the footprint that industry has in my constituency in Aberdeenshire and around the United Kingdom as a result of a 78% tax, a ban on new licenses and everything else. And that is going to have a knock-on effect on the transition, because so many of the technologies and the skilled workforce that we need to develop the technologies of the future are right now working for BP or Total or Shell or Hutaka in the North Sea. And those people are going to be attracted overseas to other countries where they still have burgeoning oil and gas industries, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Australia, Mexico, Canada, the USA, the Far East. You know, I was telling, actually, I was at Offshore Europe. It used to be the biggest oil and gas conference in the world a few weeks ago in Aberdeen. This year it was held, I think by mistake, on the same week as Offshore Asia. The number of British companies that chose not to exhibit in Aberdeen and instead exhibited in Kuala Lumpur was telling. And that we are going to see a drip, drip, drip effect of skilled workers and indeed companies to other countries in the world because of our policies in the North Sea and in oil and gas, which will impact our ability to transition to a more sustainable future that we all want to see. So it's not about me banging the drum for oil and gas, 'cause I think the future is, fossil fuel. I think that we need that industry, A, for security reasons, B, for jobs, my constituency especially, but C, because it makes eminent sense. If you want to transition, you need to have that underlying basis of the industry that we have in the UK to drive that forward. Question of jobs, absolutely. I think one of the problems with the net zero agenda that we had when we were in government was that people were promised jobs that never arrived. And whilst, yes, I did wax lyrical about our great successes, the jobs onshore did not reflect that huge success offshore. And it is difficult. We tried towards the end of our time in government to do something about that situation, but it is very difficult to reinvent a process, as Charles said, when it is so fundamentally, and probably for all the right reasons, focused on the price rather than on the other added, the job specifically. So that's that's where we are. I can't remember what the other question was. Sorry, I've completely Tidal. Yeah, well, I mean, Charles is. I mean, obviously, Charles is always right. One of the first visits I did was up to the European Tidal project up in Orkney, EMEC, and an incredible company doing amazing things. And Swansea Bay Lagoon, arguments for, arguments against. I do think its time is coming. We don't want to be in the position of allowing other countries to steal a march on the UK, so I would encourage the current government to invest in Tidal. I think it's the right thing to do.
Thank you. Josh, love to ask you what new types of jobs the EDF are creating or planning to create?
Yeah, no, well, the best example, I suppose, is on Hinkley. Hinkley was the first kind of nuclear power station in a generation, and one of the most significant acts of the previous government was to restart the nuclear sector, which the current government are now building upon. Hinkley is at a scale that you only really grasp if you go, and I recommend anyone who gets the opportunity to do so does.
It's a good video on you guys LinkedIn.
Yes, yeah, drones, that's the key. Cameras on drones makes a big difference. At peak construction, we'll have 12,000 people on site. And if you go to that area and that region, it doesn't feel like a construction project. It feels like a town. There are accommodation blocks, food areas, there are transport hubs. It is a vibrant and amazing sort of project, and it just shows the scale and the complexity of building a project of that scale. The thing, though, that is most impressive about nuclear, which sort of separates it out from potentially other technologies, is that 70% of the content is UK content. And that is because we have such a strong legacy when it comes to the nuclear sector. And that has taken time to rebuild. And I think the learning we've had from Hinkley is that does take time, and therefore you need to build both the skills and capabilities over a long period of time to give you that level of capability. And we've now got apprentices who are working on site who will hopefully evolve to other projects, but they didn't exist when we started the process around Hinkley a kind of decade or so ago. So the process now has to be around how you build and repeat technology. That's the bit where you get long-term jobs and opportunity. People go into a sector because they want to see a long-term career rather than just a single project. And so the real opportunity with technologies like nuclear, now that the process has restarted, is how you build a long-term trajectory for the sector where companies grow and see a long-term pipeline of projects. And hopefully that's what we'll see in other sectors of the kind of clean electricity space, because we are starting to see in areas we have an EV charging company, we have a solar company, we have a heat pump company. All of those are fledgling new sectors that are starting to grow at pace, But we need a long-term trajectory, certainty of policy, and ultimately, critically, a range of projects over time that then give you the certainty to invest in the sort of capability that's needed. And in terms of the types of jobs, it is a huge variety of different opportunities, from kind of logistics-orientated jobs to high-skilled welding. You see everything. And the really amazing thing, again, when you go to Hinckley, is they are not just individuals from the region. It's a huge local employer, but you get skilled welders. I was there a couple of weeks ago, and one of the skilled welding team is all based in Liverpool and come down for the projects and then go back and have opportunities to work on other projects. So it is an amazing national employment opportunity, not just a regional one.
Are the skills transferable from the oil and gas industry?
Completely, and actually one of the big challenges we have with the oil and gas sector is they tend to steal our high-skilled individuals because it's a competitive economy, right? And a lot of the tier one contractors have a kind of constrained base, and welding is a very good opportunity. We do not have enough welders in this country to build the complex infrastructure that we need, and the previous government did do a lot of work on this space, but as soon as there is a pipeline of projects for a technology like nuclear, companies will invest in the kind of applied kind of skills that are needed for a certain sector. But that's no bad thing. We should be competing because the people who gain from competing projects are the workforce, because ultimately wages go up and actually the skills base improves. So it's no bad thing, but it is a real variety, and actually there is a lot of reskilling that can go on from different sectors, but it's not as straightforward as you might think.
Okay, Ben, tidal jobs.
I'm going to leave the title because Charles has literally written a government review on it. But on the jobs point, one thing I think government doesn't do particularly well in this country is labour market intelligence. So we often don't know where the skills gaps actually are, and so we can't kind of agglomerate demand and supply on that to kind of talk in policy terms, i.e. we can't put the people where they need to be for the jobs. There's a ton of other problems there, like local infrastructure, getting from your home to the job, all that kind of stuff. But we don't identify very well, which is why, although it is an opportunity in some ways, we have situations where people are coming from Liverpool to Hinckley to work and all that kind of stuff. I think the jobs point we have to be really careful, because we collectively, politicians, corporates, lobbyists, campaigners, whatever, have talked about jobs for the last 20 years, and as Andrew quite rightly said, they haven't materialised. The offshore strategy in Scotland, perfect example, 30,000 were promised, 7,000 came. That's a big shortfall. And I think people are quite cynical to hearing jobs. And if I'm very frank, every government press release these days starts with the government is doing this thing and it's going to create this world-leading industry, 9,000 factories, 10 million jobs, everything. It's going to do everything. And good industrial policy generally does one thing and achieves it well. And in the case of offshore wind, that was building lots of offshore wind. It wasn't providing lots and lots of jobs on the coast of Scotland. So I think we need to be really careful with jobs, because until relatively recently we were in a quite high employment economy, where a lack of jobs wasn't the problem, it's the productivity of those jobs. So I think we always need to be careful when we're talking about jobs, because it's such an easy thing to say, because it sounds like a great vote winner. This is going to provide thousands and thousands of jobs. What that's actually doing is undermining confidence often in the transition when those jobs don't always materialise. So I think just a bit more honesty, to be frank, on what those jobs are, where they're going to be, who they're going to be for. The last thing I'd say is that I often find that the easy reach for a politician when they're talking about jobs is the education system. That's, of course, absolutely vital, but the timelines we're talking about clean energy build-out, they're in the next 10 years, so it's not people who are in the education system now, it's people who are in their 40s now. So it's great to hear about the kind of reskilling stuff, because whether it's 2030, 2035, whatever your kind of clean power target is, you need people who are already in the workforce, already have those skills and need to pivot into the skills that are going to build the new infrastructure we need.
Jim, tidal and/or jobs?
Just 2 quick points on jobs. One is the CBI put out a report earlier this year to say there are actually 273,000, very precise number, jobs in what they call the net zero economy. So some of those jobs came, and that part of the economy grew 10% in the previous year. So there are jobs out there. It depends what you count. But speaking of which, the other point from a review in a centre I used to run is that on the demand side, you get better labour intensity than on the supply side. So if whatever government was going to follow through on a large-scale plan to upgrade homes and insulate them and really kickstart that again, which we badly need, partly for energy security and bills reasons, that would employ a heck of a lot of people, both people who already have jobs, make them more secure, but actually upskill that whole set of professions on the demand side, which we need to do to make sure those homes get insulated to a high level of quality.
Okay, thank you. Right, 2 more questions. Right, here in the second row, and on the end over there.
Hello, thank you. Sarah Honan, AD Demand. So unsurprisingly, I think one of the key solutions to all three of these questions is demand flexibility. So £100 off bills by 2030, almost 400 by 2040, security of supply if CGT falls over, better rely on 20,000 EVs than one large power plant. And in terms of net zero, again, yeah, we just hit the 1 billion figure, 2/3 of that being to turn off gas in the south. So there's been a bit talked about demand, but it'd be good to hear more about where demand flexibility sits in your vision. And obviously, I know this was in your portfolio before.
Okay, thank you. And right on the end now.
Thank you. Tim Flagg from UK AI. I want to know how we can harness the AI opportunity and on one hand make sure that we're actually not missing the window of time that we have to lead in the world, because a lot of the solutions that we've talked about will take time to produce that energy. That's the first point. And the second point is, can the UK lead here? We've already established leadership in the world on many of the industries you've talked about, particularly renewables. We think there's an opportunity to lead in green AI as well. So I'd be interested to get the panel's perspective on that.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, so demand flexibility and the opportunity in AI. Ben?
Lucky me. So the flex point, yeah, I mean, we've actually talked about this, so you know my views already. Look, I think that I'm just going to say one thing, because I think everyone's going to have different views. Yes, we're missing an opportunity on flex. It was nice to see the government publish a low-carbon flex roadmap a few months ago. I think there's a big opportunity missed on the non-domestic market, which is so much bigger than the domestic market. And I don't know why we're not talking about it, maybe because it's not exciting compared to the domestic market. I don't know, but I think I'd love to see government do a ton more work on non-domestic flex, because I think, yeah, like you say, when you're talking about demand, that is where the actual kind of bulk of demand's going to be. On the AI stuff, yes, absolutely. And this kind of speaks to the point I was making before about the way we have designed non-domestic energy policy. I'll give an example, and it's not an AI adjacent one, but I hope it's useful. The ceramics sector is obviously energy intensive, uses a ton of energy, and is made up almost entirely of SMEs. Because those SMEs don't kind of cross a certain electro intensity threshold, they pay tons of money into the British industry supercharger, which is used to largely subsidise the steel sector's costs. And the steel sector receives a ton of subsidy. Fine, you can make lots of arguments for the importance of the domestic steel sector, but that skews so much subsidy and a vast amount of public money to one sector, which just in GDP or employment terms, or even productivity terms, is pretty small. The AI opportunity, in my view, is much, much, much bigger than the steel opportunity. I'm not saying the steel's not important, careful to say that, but we need a far more kind of economically literate view of how we design non-domestic policy. So we're looking at where those growth sectors are and how we can help them with their energy costs for this period of time before we flooded the grid with renewables and electricity sets at marginal price more often. It's not just AI. Creative industries, so the games industry, for instance, we have a massive hub outside of Edinburgh where we have huge potential. All these industries that don't get talked about in that conversation, that's kind of where I've used the slightly silly phrase about politicians' imaginations. It's easy, particularly for a Labour government in power right now, to kind of lean towards the steel sector because of that kind of political affiliation. What we need is a far more frank conversation about where the UK's future potential lies. It's quite clear, just look at the numbers talked about a few weeks ago at the AI summit, that the opportunity from AI is absolutely phenomenal. Could transform this country's economic fortunes, but that does mean that policy is going to have to flow in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Andrew?
No, the opportunities are phenomenal for AI, but it's not for me as a legislator, policymaker to answer the question, should, is the UK leading? It's for the industry to tell us. So what is it that, I'm not asking you to do that now, I'd love to have a discussion with you. What is it that we should be doing to enable AI to grow and become a thriving industry, and how could the UK lead the world in that? It is for us to engage in that conversation, for you to tell us what we need to do. It's not the other way around. Because frankly, I don't think many politicians, myself included, are anywhere close to being as educated as we need to be on AI and the potential uses of that to grow the economy in a whole host of different areas. So that's that. On demand flexibility, absolutely critical. It's key to decarbonising and reducing cost, and it will be an integral part of our fully thought through energy policy towards the next election.
Jim.
I will answer the flexibility question. I think, I mean, I've lost count of the number of flexibility strategies I've seen over the years. There are a lot, and they go back a long way. But not to be cynical, because actually we're now starting to see practical flexibility happening, not just in the big industrial sectors, but in homes, with people getting free electricity for 2 hours on a Sunday and that kind of thing. So you're starting to see that. The economic opportunities and the technical potential are large. I think the thing that sometimes gets missed is we have to think about the social side of this. You know, some people are going to want to fully embrace this, others are not going to want to touch it with a barge pole. So, you know, choice is important, and then making sure that it's not just the middle class people like me who get to reap the benefits because we can afford a solar panel and an electric car, that actually there are schemes, incentives, redistribution, doesn't matter what you want to call it, but ways in which people on just modest incomes, never mind just low incomes, can actually take part in this if they wish to. I think that's really important.
Mm-hmm. Charles?
I think this is one of the most exciting aspects of energy policy. And consumers are going to move from being the passive recipients of whatever their energy companies let them have and offer to them, to being people who decide when they generate, when they store, when they sell back, when they use. And so they can actually start to be traders in their own rights and generators in their own right. And I think it's going to totally transform things over time. So I think it's hugely important, and it goes directly into AI as well, because at the end of the day, I don't want to be popping down to put my dishwasher on and my tumble dryer on. I want it all to be sorted out automatically without me having to do much about it. My wife gets ludicrously excited when an offer comes through.
When you turn on the dishwasher.
When there's an offer which comes through, and we go down the pub and we spend much more money than we've saved. But so for somebody who's not historically been interested in energy issues, and people like her, it really brings them into this to feel that they are part of the solution and they've got a role to play. On the AI side, I think we've got some really big decisions to make on this, because there's a lot of conversation about AI and SMRs going side by side. But I've got to worry about the time frame, and that people want the AI centres to be started to be developed now. The SMRs won't be ready until the 2030s. So they've got to do something initially, which could be renewables and backup, but you're probably going to have gas in the system as well. But if you've built a gas plant, perhaps a CCUS, would you then replace that with an SMR in due course? And I think we need a much clearer strategy for how we're going to make that forward. And I think in the national interest, we probably also need to decide what we need to prioritise. We don't necessarily need a big data centre so you can get your TikTok messages 1 millisecond faster. But we do need it for defence, we do need it for pharmaceuticals and for health, and that we should be taking a national interest view as to what data centres we've got to have here as a matter of national policy making. In Wyoming, you can build a massive data centre and the associated power generation, and nobody minds because nobody lives there. Oh, I've never been to Wyoming, but that's my assumption. Whereas in the UK, it's going to be much, much more challenging. And I think people would be delighted to have an SMR if it's for their own use and for the wider economic benefit. But they're not going to be so keen to have a massive data centre which employs nobody and an SMR which employs 10 people and is a massive blot on their local landscape. So I think there's a really difficult issue which has to be worked through here.
And the blot on the landscape point is something we haven't turned to yet, and that it is a
true.
very live debate in parts of our country, the electrification journey and the impact that's having on communities up and down the UK.
Yeah, okay, Josh, do you want to come in quickly on either of those?
Yeah, just very quickly on both. On flexibility, the thing we've learned as a company, slightly to the point that's been made, is you have to make it simple, because the vast majority of people aren't going to want to engage every 5 minutes, but actually they don't need to, because you've got technologies that exist already. We're doing a Sunday Saver thing at the moment where effectively you get free electricity if you use slightly less electricity during peak during the week. Simple, people understand it. It's been the thing that actually people have responded to, and so we've got to try and make it simple for people. The other thing we have to not forget is flexibility doesn't just come from households and businesses. We still desperately need flexibility on a grid level, and so it's conversations on grid scale batteries, pump storage, kind of big technologies that will play a big role, especially in Scotland, where a lot of the power is going to be sited, and we need a better flexibility strategy in addition to the network build that's obviously critically important. On AI, there's obviously the data center build element, and we made some announcements recently in relation to transforming an old coal site at Cottam into being a host for data centers, and the local community are very supportive on the basis, as you've said, that it actually generates real jobs in the construction phase and is sited well as forms of power supply. And people quite often say we can't build data centers in this country, the prices are too high. We might not get the hyperscalers, but actually we have already got about 2 gigawatts of existing data centers, and we think actually there's a very strong argument for a lot more, and we will have them. And so it's about making the system flexible and quick, and critically getting grid connection reform sorted, so actually those projects come through on the pace that's needed. The thing, though, that really makes a difference is the business application of that AI. And we're already seeing amazing breakthroughs, whether it's kind of planning construction schedules, HPC, whether it's improving the way we do customer service. It's really quite incredible, the pace of change. The thing that parliamentarians can do is not overly regulate the sector to ensure that we can't just apply that from a business perspective, because we get asked a lot by the regulatory system, how do we regulate for AI? AI is already happening. So the critical thing is that we let the power of the technology come through with the right safeguards that exist to ensure that it's then applied in the right way. And so there is a slight risk of, at least I would say, regulating for an outcome, when in reality the power of the technology is obviously critically important and will benefit people in this country as much as anywhere else.
Okay, just one more. So here on the second row.
Thank you very much. Trevor Hutchings, I'm the Chief Executive of the REA, the Renewable Energy Trade Association. I guess my question was to pick it up on the point that Jim made around how gas influence our electricity prices. What's the panel's view on how do we decouple that?
Jim, you want to start? We'll go down.
Yeah, it's. I mean, the current government's approach is to kind of let it work itself out over time. You know, they did have an opportunity started under the previous government when the price crisis hit, of saying, oh, we're going to do radical market reform and try and really decouple it, you know, change the way in which the market works. But in the end, I think they've decided not to do that and hope that that decoupling just happens naturally as we deploy more renewables and new nuclear, etc. I think politically that's a risky strategy, and it may not bring prices down as quickly enough. So I think returning to some ideas of market reform, but I think the risk of that again is investment. So you've got to do the reform whilst keeping that investment going, and that's the really difficult thing in there. But something like putting gas plants into a strategic reserve or something like that, just to try and take them out of the market, might be one option to do that.
Yeah, I agree that it's time to do another market reform process. We assumed that the CFDs in that market reform process would last until the mid-2020s. It is now due for renewal to see whether it's still the right way to take this going forward. I think more generally, I think one of the issues which we're going to face is that the gas price is expected to tumble dramatically. Not next year, but from 27 through to the end of the decade. The big US LNG exports, Qatar is starting a process of doubling their LNG exports. And so the gas price may well halve. Now, at that point, the consumer will turn around and say, you've told me I'm paying high prices because of gas. Why am I not seeing the full benefits? Because gas prices are now tumbling down. And the difficult answer is that actually the contract for difference for renewables will then go up because it's linked to the wholesale price. And so that the consumer will then very directly be paying more money in order to have clean, renewable energy. And I don't think people have started to realise how difficult and toxic that debate is going to become. We do need to prepare for it, because it's absolutely clear that's where the gas price is going.
I've very little to add, because Charles has absolutely hit the nail on the head. I think that is the debate which we're going to be seeing from about 27, 28 onwards. I think consumers out there are going to notice it. And I don't know if this government, and I don't know if we are ready to have that full and frank discussion with the British people about it. I'm reluctant to get dragged into a discussion on market reform, given under strict instructions not to make any policy announcements. But quite clear, overdue. And I'm surprised, actually, that the current government, the Labour Party, didn't actually take the opportunity they had when they came in to actually to do this. I'm surprised. I'm not saying that we would have. I'm surprised that they didn't.
Yeah, me too.
No, I guess there's two questions within that. There's the how do you finance the sort of the flexible technologies that sit alongside the kind of increasing proportion of clean electricity, and there's a big debate there, and I think the Palestinian rights say market reform is part of that. The challenge is there's no simple solutions. Gas plants are going to continue to operate increasingly intermittently but flexibly over that period of time. simply putting them in a strategic reserve, they'll still have to be paid an element of return over those projects. So some reports have gone around how kind of will unlock immediate consumer savings. We need to think quite carefully how we do that right, and sort of that's where the previous reform process got to, where it kind of struggled with that question. But it's a question we need to really internalise and think through. The other element, obviously, is how do we pay for the chunk of infrastructure investment that's needed? And the point that I think you made earlier, Ben, around traditionally that's been done through the consumer bill. The big question that any government is going to have is that the right model moving forward, and particularly on the electricity bill? But again, that is a chunk of cost that does have to be paid for. And it's good to see that the kind of current government is starting to think about that question, but they still haven't published consultation on that kind of broader cost allocation question. So for me, it's both market reform, but also that kind of cost allocation question that matters as much.
Ben?
Yeah, I'm just going to agree with most of what's been said. I worry that as we are currently set up, that the conversation around strategic reserve, for instance, just ends up on the bill payer. I feel the same way about the British industry supercharged, the new non-domestic scheme next year. So much of this just looks like it's going to end up on the bill payer, and it's easy to push for things which in principle are not a bad idea, but the lesson of the last 15 years is the bill payer always ends up paying. So without that reform first, and I think that first point is crucial, I'm not sure it helps. I did feel when we were having the conversation in the decoupling conversation during the REMA process, sorry to kind of probably bring up some traumas, Andrew, that the decoupling conversation was trying to solve a problem which is already kind of a year past the solution that was being proposed, if that makes sense, particularly when you've got the Green Power Pool discussion coming in as part of that process. Not that it was a bad idea, but I don't think it solved the problem, and I think Charles has eloquently explained why. I don't think that the capital required to do decoupling now and protect the consumer justifies the amount of government have to spend doing that.
Okay, thank you. Right, the final questions from me, and it's very quick because I'm going to ask the panel to say in one sentence what is the number one thing we should do to achieve clean, secure and affordable energy for the UK. One sentence. Jim?
Don't repeal the Climate Change Act and continue investing in renewables.
Okay. Charles?
Carry people with you. We need to ensure that the public are part of this debate and they feel part of delivering solutions.
Great. Andrew?
Build more nuclear quicker.
Josh?
Make electricity cheaper.
Can I say make electricity cheaper? No. Stop playing politics and rebalance bills.
Nice. Okay. Well, thank you very much to EDF for partnering with us on this panel, and a big round of applause for the panel.